Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is a new book, a book by Karl Nordenstreng. It's the Mass Media Declaration of UNESCO. He is a Finnish author who has written about UNESCO and has written about the Mass Media Declaration of UNESCO. And the Yankee press and the Yankee government, the U.S. government, and the U.S. mass media, their concern and problems with the Mass Media Declaration of UNESCO, for which they withdrew from UNESCO after a 4-year fight about this Mass Media Declaration. We're going to go very, critically through this book because, like we said, the most important order of business for us is basically the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. My goal in this presentation is to get the United States expelled from UNESCO. Their history is one of hate for UNESCO. Their history of scandalizing UNESCO with bitter campaigns in the press and their mass media and their government. Their government officials behaved like, just scoundrels. Their press behaved like scoundrels. They went against UNESCO, attacked UNESCO for so many bitter things that UNESCO didn't have any control over. The United States itself politicized this organization and then complained about its politics. And, they kept China out of the UN and UNESCO for 21 years. Yet they, got angry that UNESCO had sanctions and had trouble with the Israeli government for its attacks on Arab cities. So all of these things go into the Mass Media Declaration of UNESCO and why the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. They do not belong in this organization. They should not get the privilege of being a member of a third world organization committed to education, science, and culture because they attack education in the third world. Their colonial wars result in death and destruction to educational facilities. We know about Iran war. We know about all the different wars that they have. The Panama invasion. They attacked education, murdered, fired, and expelled so many universities, professors, scientists, journalists, and cultural people. You just need to read the book Invasion of Panama, which I just went through, and you'll know that the United States removes educational people. So all of the information, all of the things that is related to expelling the United States from UNESCO. We need to expel the United States from UNESCO. So let's talk a little bit about why the United States press is so, fraudulent. Why is the United States press so unreadable, so, not committed to journalism standards, not committed to journalism ethics, not committed to professional responsibility or accountability? That's the major problem of the United States press is they don't have any accountability. They're not responsible people. They're RAMBO journalists. They're hit and run journalists. They are, violent journalists. We talked about all these three concepts in the book Hope and Folly, the United States and UNESCO Relations from 1945 to 1985. We're also talking about what the press uses, what kinds of journalism. Journalism is science. It's not an art of, white supremacy. It's not an art of white people just walking around and sowing conflict and then yelling at somebody and writing those racist ideas or any conflict ideas onto paper. It is a science in which you have to balance perspective. You have to have balanced perspective. You have to have unselective reporting. You have to have a diversity of opinion and sources. The United States press fails miserably in that regard. They basically use outright lies, fabrication, falsification, omission, suppression, selective reporting, blatant bias, unbalanced coverage, and non-diverse media reporting, resulting in a propagandist ministry of lies that is part of the U.S. government's propaganda machine. The Mass Media Declaration of UNESCO enforces standards. The Mass Media Declaration of UNESCO enforces standards, responsibilities, ethics, licensing, and third world requirements for objective media rejected by the U.S. government and media. Basically, the organization was condemned as a group of, less distinguished blacks, Hispanics, and Asians of the third world. They called them extortionists and tyrant third world agents. They're basically the American government uses defamatory and deceitful propaganda system of the U.S. government. It's not an objective press. It is a defamatory and deceitful propaganda wing of the U.S. government. It fosters bias, suppression, selective reporting, falsification, fabrication, unbalanced coverage, non-diversity in viewpoints, omissions, and outright lies. So remember the timeline of UNESCO is that before 1985, the organization was founded in 1945, and until 1985, the United States was in the organization. But between 1980 and 1984, they conducted a war with scandalizing UNESCO. They scandalized it with bitter propaganda and hate against the organization. It was a hate campaign by the U.S. mass media, for which 1984 culminated in Ronald Reagan withdrawing from UNESCO. 37 years they remained out. They backed their, Ronald Reagan, their hysterical Yankee, for 37 years. And then they went right back in 2023. As if you can just willy-nilly join an organization 37 years after, getting out in a scandalized way, embittering the people in the organization, and then come right back in and, foster colonialism in a third world organization, committed to nationalism, anti-apartheid, anti-racism, in favor of, nationalism and sovereignty for states. And then after that, in 2023, they rejoined. And then they fostered colonial wars of aggression against Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. They kidnapped a democratically elected leader of a UNESCO state. They bombed schools, university, media facilities, and all sorts of educational and cultural centers in Iran. All of those reasons require the United States to be expelled from UNESCO. So let's get started. We're gonna, we're not gonna go so quickly, but I'm gonna read the preface. The preface is, about 6 pages, and I think it'll be a good, starting point. So, on November 22nd, 1978, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, made up of virtually all independent states in the world, adopted by acclamation a document called Declaration on the Fundamental Principles Concerning the Contribution of the Mass Media for Strengthening Peace and International Understanding for the Promotion of Human Rights and to countering racialism, apartheid, and incitement for war. The consensus grew out of a decade-long professional and political debate on the role of the mass media in society and the world at large, a debate which has since continued as controversy around the concept of a new international information order. The Mass Media Declaration constitutes a landmark in the history of journalism and mass communication, demonstrating the unprecedented political attention which mass media issues gained throughout the world in the 1970s. Moreover, the declaration can be seen in the words of Amadar Mataumabau, the Director General of UNESCO, as new principles which all creators and distributors of information would be able to endorse, since for the first time the international community has at its disposal a body of principles and ideals, such as can provide guidance for the action and practice of all those whose hearts are set on justice and peace. So just a comment here. Remember that the Declaration on the Fundamental Principles Concerning the Contribution of the Mass Media to Strengthening Peace and International Understanding, to the Promotion of Human Rights, and to countering racialism, apartheid, and incitement for war. These are opposite of the United States press. Okay, they strengthen conflict and international hate. Look, that's the American government, press, and their U.S. mass media. They foster human cruelty. That is the U.S. government and its mass media. And they, promote racialism and promote apartheid and incite war. So all of the declaration of the mass media, for which the United States just recently joined, is against their media. Their media is pro-racialist, anti-peace and international understanding. They're pro-war and conflict. And they are also against human rights. They're not a member of the United Nations, UN Declaration of Human Rights. And they endorse racialism. They were for apartheid. Remember, the U.S. government supported South Africa for apartheid, against, freeing and liberating the blacks of South Africa. In addition, there is an important aspect here that journalism requires professional standards. Okay, the mass media declaration was meant to produce professional standards of proper media, dissemination, diverse reporting, no lies in the media, no falsifications. Fact check your data, fact check your information, promote all of the different sources, promote all of the different viewpoints, and create a science for journalism. Not an art of, a white man, a simpleton, a simpleton Yankee going out there and saying, I picked a fight with a black man. And I put that all on paper, like my anger and, what my viewpoint is. I picked a fight with an Asian, and I just, translate that into the New York Times article. That's the U.S. press. Okay, this is for science. This is for journalism science. And the United States press needs to be expelled from UNESCO. The U.S. press and the United States government needs to be expelled from UNESCO for not following their rules and declaration. It is indeed remarkable that an agreement could be found upon such a body of principles and ideals at a time when ideological confrontations, rather than harmony, became characteristic of the international community. As Mabau put it, the outcome was an example of the triumph of patient efforts to achieve conciliation and the preeminence which should be given to worldwide approach, which, while still taking account of specific circumstances, gives pride of place to the common interest of mankind. Politically, it was a triumph of detente, peaceful coexistence between different social systems, so-called East and West, North and South. Professionally, it was a reminder of the fact that journalism and mass communication, however ideologic in nature, has a common ground and universal values on which an international code of ethics can be constructed. So that's one. So again, journalism is a science that although it can be ideologic, okay, has a common ground and universal values on which international codes of ethics can be constructed. You can't just make up stuff in the media like Maduro is a drug terrorist and then just, call that as, fact. Okay, you have to have evidence. You have to have all viewpoints. You have to have the Hispanics of Venezuela explain their viewpoint. You have to have the Colombians of Latin America explain their free viewpoint. You have to have the Chileans and Brazilians explain their viewpoint on Maduro. Not just, make it up in the U.S. press and say he goes down for terrorism charges. That is the U.S. government. They're rapists, butcher, short-tempered Yankee whites. And they need to be expelled from UNESCO for just lying and committing fraud and imprisoning Maduro and lying about what it is. There needs to be multiple viewpoints. You need to take into account popular opinion in Latin America when you imprison a Latin American leader. You cannot do it in a white vacuum of racism and, Yankee hate and Yankee short-tempered Yankee action. It cannot just be short-tempered Yankee whites just working the system and saying what they want. So that is an important fact. Since November 1978, these optimistic perspectives of universal humanism have been challenged increasingly by political developments towards greater rather than reduced use of force in settling international disputes, and towards more rather than less power to the ruthless market forces in determining relations between the rich and poor. The law of the jungle. In returning, said President Nair of Tanzania, in receiving the 1981 Third World Prize in New Delhi in February 1982, after meeting with President Reagan and in the North-South Summit in Cancun. Indeed, by the middle of 1982, the world has turned more into an uncivilized jungle with military force instead of reason and negotiations determining the cause of events in the Malvinas, Falkland Islands, and in Lebanon. At the diplomatic level, the United States refused to join the most comprehensive collective exercise in setting mutually beneficial roles for the international community, the Law of the Sea Treaty. At the United Nations, the second special session and disarmament meeting during Israel's raiding of the Palestinians in Lebanon failed to agree on anything substantial about the greatest global problem facing mankind. So you can see the United States, they're in their own world. They can have their press, they can have their colonial press, but they do not have the privilege of being in a third world organization that requires standards and rules for your journalism. They just make up stuff. They make up stuff about Iran, and then they go to war with Iran against UNESCO Charter. They make up stuff about Venezuela, and then they kidnap the ruler against UNESCO Charter. They make up stuff about Cuba, and then they go to war, they navally blockade Cuba, and then that's against UNESCO Charter. So all of these things, the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. So we talked about basically, the forces settling market international disputes. There's now basically political developments towards greater use of force in setting international disputes and towards more rather than less power to the ruthless market forces and determining the relations between the rich and the poor. So this is the United States. The United States pushes greater international force in settling of disputes. It pushes for more ruthless market forces in, increasing the income inequality in countries. So that is something that UNESCO is trying to go around and do work against. And that is why they withdrew. That is the reason the United States withdrew from UNESCO. They withdrew because they wanted to work against UNESCO. They didn't like a democratic organization in which whites didn't have, the majority vote. It was an automatic, white American majority. It required a vote. There were blacks there, right? But blacks have a vote, Asians have a vote. That's what they thought, and that's why they withdrew from the organization, because they wanted majority, automatic white majority rule. So, the Malvinas, Falkland Islands we talked about, and Lebanon. The United States refused to join the comprehensive collective exercise in setting mutually beneficial rules for the international community, the Law of the Sea Treaty, right? So the United States refused to join the Law of the Sea Treaty. And obviously, because of that, they withdrew. They just started to go on their own imperialist, colonialist conquest. And so they withdrew, for which they need to be expelled from UNESCO. To rejoin after withdrawing from UNESCO and, violating all UNESCO principles, they need to be expelled from UNESCO. In the field of journalism and mass communication, the same development was reflected in the vote at the United Nations General Assembly in December 1981, when the U.S., together with Israel, broke the consensus which had prevailed ever since the adoption of the Mass Media Declaration. Since the beginning of 1981, the U.S. government, in alliance with private enterprise spokesmen from journalists and academic communities throughout the Western Hemisphere, has waged a campaign against the movements, which, after bringing about the Mass Media Declaration, promoted a number of other projects towards a new order. So you can see in the field of journalism and mass communication, the same development was reflected by the UN General Assembly in December 1981, when the U.S., together with Israel, broke the consensus which had prevailed ever since the adoption of the Mass Media Declaration. Since 1981, the U.S. government, in alliance with private enterprise spokesmen from journalists and academic communities, they're academic scholars, and basically throughout the Western Hemisphere, has waged a campaign against the movement of the Mass Media Declaration, which, after bringing about the Mass Media Declaration, promoted a number of other projects towards a new order. So the mass media was promoting a new communications order. The U.S. government, in alliance with private enterprise spokespersons, journalists, and academic communities throughout the Yankee academia, and maybe some Western governments, waged a campaign against the movement. So, obviously, the Mass Media Declaration is a completely democratic declaration established by 161 member states, voted in a democratic process. So if the United States doesn't like it, they need to get out of the organization. They're not welcome in it. They need to follow the rules. They're the ones that criticize the Mass Media Declaration. And the Mass Media Declaration is the only standards for journalists. If they want irresponsible journalism, if they want fraudulent lies, if they want suppression, if they want selective reporting, if they want non-diverse reporting, if they want fabrication, falsification, and omissions, then let them be out of UNESCO and have their own, cavalier Yankee press of RAMBO and hit-and-run journalists, and then it'll be fine. But they cannot be in UNESCO. A central theme in the campaign has been the efforts by the Soviet Union and some third world governments to legitimize under the rubric of a new international order International Information Order, NIIO, government controls over the collection, transmission, and publication of news by the press and other mass media, as the concern was expressed in a study on the United States policy towards the United Nations, issued in early 1982 by a U.S. group of prominent international affairs experts, including former Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Cyrus Vance, and Edmund Muskie. Corporate-sponsored advertisers. Okay, so the U.S., attacked government control of information, collection, transmission, and publication of the news and press by the mass media, and, published a statement against the Soviet need. So my opinion, and I think most people's opinion, is that a responsible press would be best fostered by government responsibility. Okay, if the Soviet Union is responsible for their press, they will do a better job. If the Chinese government is responsible for their press, they will do a better job. If the Japanese government is responsible for their press, they will do a better job. If you leave in the hands of corporate people like New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, and Reader's Digest, then you will get outright lies, suppression, fabrication, falsification, and omission. And it will serve as a, war propaganda, journalism for the U.S. government. It will serve as a racist journalism for the U.S. government. It will serve as a, imperialist journalism for the U.S. government. And that is what the U.S. press is. It is not an objective press. It is a propaganda system of the U.S. government. So basically, corporate-sponsored advertisements of the campaign warned against danger at the UN, where both press freedoms and economic freedoms are under attack. The defenders of economic freedoms, led by President Reagan in Cancun, were urged to fight back, and it was recommended that the United States should not feel compelled to continue its generosity toward UN agencies that remain relentlessly hostile in freedom of information and other fundamental freedoms of democracy, other fundamental principles of democracy. So Reagan is the one that withdrew. And he said in Cancun that, they should not feel compelled toward UN agencies that remain hostile to freedom of information. Right? Freedom of information, lack of social responsibility of information is what Reagan was looking for. Just, outright lies can just be propagated across. Freedom of whites to propagandize is what Reagan is saying. He's not talking about freedom of information. He's talking about freedom of whites to propagandize and lie across the information order. So that is against UNESCO guidelines. And that is not a workable system. That is an unethical system. They are, short-tempered Yankee white, con artists that want freedom of information. They need to be expelled from UNESCO. The United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. The evidence provided by this volume sharply contradicts such an understanding of the situation, which appears to be a flagrant fabrication rather than an adequate reflection of reality. Certainly there is a great deal of ignorance involved in this campaign, but it is also obvious that to accuse UNESCO of promoting government control is, in many cases, only an excuse to defend the status quo, the old order with its built-in bias against the very principles of the mass media declaration, to strengthen the peace and international understanding, to promote human rights, to counter racialism, apartheid, and war propaganda. So basically, it's bias. The U.S. mass media and the U.S. government is biased. It has a built-in bias against the mass media declaration, which is seeking to strengthen peace and international understanding, promoting human rights, and countering racialism, apartheid, and war propaganda. Whereas it is not fashionable to refrain from supporting these noble ideals of the international community, at least from paying lip service to them, it is a virtue to defend freedom against censorship. So basically, they're playing lip service. All right. Whereas it is not fashionable to refrain from approving these noble ideals of the international community, at least from paying lip service to them. It is a virtue to defend freedom against censorship. So basically, the U.S. press, rather than even just paying lip service to the international ideals of the international community as what they want is good journalism, is just basically freedom. It's freedom to, lie. It's freedom to just, put your anger on paper and publish that. That's the Yankee press. Put your anger, your short-tempered white anger on paper and publish it. And that is what the Yankee press is. They are rapist, butcher, short-tempered Yankee whites. All the same, the campaign falls both short of truthfulness and honesty. The new Secretary General of the UN, Javier Perez de Cuellar, made this point in his first speech on communication in June 1982, addressing the UN Committee on Information in New York. Unfortunately, influential sections of the mass media in a number of countries seem to have been alarmed by the adoption of the declaration and by the debates which have subsequently occurred on this subject, and their presentation of it to the public has reflected certain unfounded fears. The nature and intention of the mass media declaration has, in the process, been considered misperceived. The declaration, though a formal and solemn instrument, is not in any way binding upon states, not, of course, upon the media. Its articles, whether directed to the mass media or to its states, do not participate to be anything but advisory. What then is the use of such a document, it might be asked? The answer is that its use lies in stating a generally acceptable approach on a matter of critical importance to the international community. The declaration refers to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to the 1966 Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and thus by implication to the legal obligations of states to assist the mass media to implement its moral and professional obligations. Critics of the declaration, who express concern that national public authorities have been given an instrument to limit freedom of the press, are mistaken. Such a concept was not and could never be the intention of any United Nations deliberative body in which free and open debate always prevails. So again, very well put. The misperception of the United States government of the mass media declaration of UNESCO reflects their, delusions about what it says. And it also reflects their hate against the third world, mandating responsibility and proper, honest journalism. Social responsibilities in journalism, not a way where you can just, say whatever you feel like and put that on paper. It requires social responsibilities. It requires reliable information. It requires, all perspectives, right? All opinions need to be included in journalism. It is a science. It is not someone who can just leave the womb of a woman and then just become a journalist. That's the Yankee press. They are frauds. They are, con artists. They are deceitful liars. They are liars, they're suppressors, they are emitters, they're fabricators, they're falsifiers, and they are, unselective, unbalanced, and non-diverse reporters. Perez de Cuellar, and it is both the legal obligation of states to assist the mass media to implement in moral and professional obligations. So there are moral obligations to the mass media, right? It's not just you can just say whatever you feel like it. There are moral obligations to the mass media. And the United States government does not believe there are any moral obligations. They don't believe their press has any responsibility whatsoever. Perez de Cuellar also emphasized that our thoughts and actions are daily affected by the nature and quality of the information directed to us, and that the structures of world peace are often built in the media of ordinary people based on feelings of security and confidence in a just and rational world. Indeed, considering the deterioration of the international situation since the adoption of the Declaration, it can be said that its importance has become the greater the more the world has been pushed toward the law of the jungle. The emerging universal ethics of journalism reflect the same constitution as are manifested in the new peace movement, demanding a freeze on all nuclear weapons. Both are inspired by an intellectual and moral realization that the world is heading toward a disaster unless the course of development is drastically changed. So a great comment, the universal ethics, the emerging universal ethics in journalism. That's because the U.S. government has no ethics. The U.S. mass media has no ethics. They're just, hot-tempered whites. They just, walk around, and whenever they get aggravated, they just make comments in their press. So that's why you can't have journalism like that. You can't have a press like that. But if you want to, you can. You can, be, your own colonial Rambo. You can be your own colonial, imperialist press. You can have your own colonialism press where you promote your, fraudulent white supremacy ideas and then just, stick it to whoever you want. You go murder and, invade and, destroy schools, education, science, all of that stuff, destroy the journalism, and then come out and say, we're in charge and we have a free press there because we destroyed the opposition newspapers, right? We destroyed all the opposition newspapers. We killed all the, indigenous scholars. And now we're, in charge of the press. And, now it's a free press, right? That's the Yankees we know. That's the Yankees. The rapist, butcher, short-tempered Yankee whites. The fundamental nature of the mass media declaration, its prehistory and significance, makes it an indispensable part of the knowledge of all professional communicators, journalists, and other producers of mass media content, as well as those responsible for the management of mass media enterprises and for the training of their creative personnel. Beyond that, the message of this book is intended for those diplomats and other decision makers in international relations who shape the normative and political framework within which the mass media operate. The book is divided into 3 parts. The first focuses on the diplomatic process of formulating the declaration in the context of a new international information order. The second part reviews the international laws applicable to the field of journalism and mass communication. It is an introduction to the emerging area of study, which has been generally greatly enhanced by the Declaration. The third part covers another area which, along with the UNESCO debate in the 1970s, has become more and more central for professional communications, the social ethics and philosophical foundations of mass communications. So we're talking about journalism and mass communication and reviewing the international law applicable to journalism. There are international rules regarding journalism and mass communication, and that is UNESCO. That is the goal of UNESCO, to have international rules regarding journalism and mass communication. And the social ethics and its philosophical foundations of mass communication, another important aspect of mass communication. Throughout the book has been written as a scientific contribution to a debate which has predominantly political and polemical in nature, even in academic community. This has necessitated many and lengthy quotes in the text and the extensive appendices in the end. In systematic studies of mass communication, the present book fits in a unit of international communication with other basic readings, such as National Sovereignty and International Communication by Ablex in 1979, and Many Voices, One World, the McBride Report, UNESCO 1980. For those interested in further study, much relevant material is listed in the footnotes. And then there's, multiple people. This is a Finnish author. He's writing from Europe. He's a very smart gentleman. And he has a very intellectual and proper analysis of the UNESCO Mass Media Declaration. Unlike the Yankee rapist, butcher, short-tempered Yankee whites, he has a very solid foundation and a very proper analysis of the Mass Media Declaration and media journalism ethics in general. Declaration, Chapter 1. Declaration on Fundamental Principles concerning the contribution of the mass media to strengthening the peace and international understanding, to the promotion of human rights, and to the countering racialism, apartheid, and incitement to war, is perhaps the most thoroughfully negotiated text about journalism and mass communication which has ever been produced. The text itself, reproduced as Appendix 1 to this volume, is hardly revolutionary. In fact, as at first glance, it may appear as a piece of obscure political rhetoric written in UNESCO, not particularly appealing to mass media professionals. A closer look shows, however, that the Declaration constitutes a significant case, not so much because of its manifest content, but rather due to its political and professional implications. These can be read in the 6-year-long history of preparing the Declaration, a history which makes up a central chapter in a global movement towards a new international information order. Therefore, the adoption of the Declaration of the General Conference of UNESCO in November 1978, without dissenting votes from any of UNESCO's 146 member states at the time, was not just another event of routine diplomacy, but indeed a historical move. So give me 1 second, I'll be right back. Glad you could join us today. Okay, so we're going to continue here. By adopting the Mass Media Declaration, the international community had determined for the first time overall guidelines for the mass media, comprehensive, albeit vague, and furthermore, this had happened without divisive vote by consensus. It is a diplomatic miracle that such an outcome was possible in a case which had caused more controversy in UNESCO and in general among those involved with the mass media than perhaps any other single issue had previously. That the case had become politically hot is only natural, since that issue were not only matters of the mass media, but ultimately the fundamental values of different socioeconomic political systems. Not without reason, then, was the passing of this declaration seen to be an outstanding achievement for UNESCO and a personal victory for its Director General, Amadou Matar Mabou. Mabou's own assessment of the significance of the consensus reached at UNESCO is reproduced as Appendix 2. Yet the declaration is not only a landmark of diplomacy, but also a significant case for the professional field of journalism and mass communication. The debate throughout the process of its drafting had not only been political, but also professional, extending from the problems of everyday practice, such as working conditions of journalists, to philosophical foundations of the professionals, such as the role and tasks of the mass media and in society. And there is little doubt that the result is subscribed to by a majority of the working journalists in the world. A demonstration of this support can be found in the Mexico Declaration, which was issued on April 3rd, 1980 by 5 international and regional organizations of journalists representing together some 300,000 professionals in all parts of the world. See Appendix 25. We will read the Mexico Declaration as part of the appendix. That is the only one I will have time to read. But all of the declarations are given in this book, and I recommend you buy this book. Get the PDF. The Google Drive link will be in the description section. Please download the book, but please buy this book on Amazon and keep it in print. It's essential to keep this book in print. You can order it, and then when it is published, when it is available for selling, it will be sent to you. So please order the book and buy all of my books that I give on podcast. That helps keep them in print and keep them, keep the U.S. government from censoring these books, because that is what they are trying to do. So, therefore, a study of this declaration is of importance in education of journalists, both for professional training and lifelong education. The 3 chapters in Part 1 are intended to help in introducing the declaration into the programs of journalism and training and retaining it on the permanent agenda of the professional debate. Chapter 1 outlines the international political context out of which the declaration emerged and within which its adventurous formulation occurred in the 1970s. This chapter also provides a review of relevant developments after the adoption of the declarations until early 1982, by which time the movement towards a new international information order had entered another stage of confrontation. Chapter 2 provides concrete historical evidence related to various stages of the drafting process of the declaration, with special emphasis on what took place behind the doors of diplomatic meetings. Chapter 3 provides a brief analysis of the final text itself from the point of view of professional standards of journalism. Article 8 of the Declaration makes a direct appeal that people who participate in the professional training of journalists and who assist them in performing their functions in a responsible manner should attach special importance to the principles of this declaration when drawing up and ensuring application of their codes of ethics. In fact, it is impossible to look at the declaration in isolation from the general normative framework provided by so-called international law on the one hand, and from the nature of ethics of the profession of journalism on the other. Therefore, Part 1 of this book should be seen as an introduction in terms of the concrete history of the Declaration to the topics that are dealt with in Parts 2 and 3. So excellent little section. We give the Declaration of the Mass Media Again, the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. The goal of this presentation is to expel the United States from UNESCO. They do not subscribe to these, topics. They do not believe there should be professional standards and ethics, and they should not be involved in the organization. They will ruin it. They will, stop these ethical standards. They will stop journalism, having standards. And the UNESCO should get the United States out. They need to be expelled from UNESCO. So let's talk. So basically, the Mass Media Declaration, we described it. It's for fostering peace and international understanding, promoting human rights, and countering racialism, apartheid, and incitement for war. Basically, it's most thoroughly negotiated text about journalism and mass communications which has ever been produced. So it's the most thorough, treatise or most thorough declaration and text, the most thoroughly negotiated text on journalism that has ever been produced. The text is reproduced in Appendix 1. Please see it. The text in Appendix 1 is basically, we see Appendix 1 says, and just pull it up here. Appendix 1 is, it goes through all of the articles and it describes the Declaration of the Fundamental Principles concerning the contribution of the mass media to strengthening peace and international understanding, to the promotion of human rights and countering racialism, apartheid, and incitement for war. A 20th session, October to November 1978 of UNESCO. It's a UNESCO document. And it goes through all of the articles and all of the things. So, you can read that, on your own time. That's a good thing to take a look at. Okay, so basically, it's actually, the Declaration constitutes a significant case, not so much because of its manifest contents, but rather due to its political and professional implications. These can be read in the 6-year-long history in preparing the Declaration, a history which makes up a central chapter in the global movement towards a new international information order. Okay, not without reason then was the passing of the Declaration seen to be an outstanding achievement for UNESCO and a personal victory for its Director General, Amadou Matar Mabao. So this was a victory. This was an outstanding piece of work that Mr. Mabao, a Senegalese African, that, was a was scandalized by the United States. The racism of the U.S. government, Ronald Reagan's administration, they walked over him. The mass media laughed at him. They called him a crazy African third world, whatever. They're racist, right? They just, unloaded their propaganda machine against Amadou Mabao, for which they need to be expelled from UNESCO. Their behavior against Mr. Mabao as a mass press needs them to be expelled from UNESCO. So basically, the Declaration is not only a landmark of diplomacy, but also a significant case for the professional field of journalism and mass communication. The debate throughout the process of its drafting had not only been political, but also professional, extending from problems of philosophical foundations of the profession, such as the role and task of the mass media in society. And there is little doubt that the results are subscribed to by a majority of the working journalists in the world. So this is a text that the majority of working journalists subscribe to. The U.S. mass media does not. The U.S. mass media does not subscribe to it. They do their own thing. They join, but they're not part of it. They don't, acknowledge it. They just recently joined, so it hasn't been reviewed. But the bottom line is they need to be expelled. But, these are standards. These are professional standards. Imagine a lawyer, that, has to practice. Then he has standards. Then you just say, there's an international body that says that there need to be standards for lawyers. You can't just practice your own trade. And the U.S. just says, hell with you. We're going to do our own thing. That's the whites of the Yankees. They just do their own thing. But, they do have, the Yankees, you have to give them some, understanding. There are certain, situations where they do focus on standards, right? It's not journalism. They definitely don't circus. But on nuclear weapons, right? I mean, they're very meticulous about, science and, standards for nuclear weapons, right? That's because they like to, slaughter hundreds and millions of third world people. So they are a nuclear, standards. They are nuclear standards, but they are not journalistic or scientific or educational standards. They have nuclear standards, how to, destroy so many people, and not worry too much about it. Those are the standards that the U.S. government is. They are rapist, butcher, short-tempered Yankee whites. So basically, so that is it. And then we talked about the Mexico Declaration. That's a huge one. And I will read that for this because that is the best one. That is the best one. It was formulated by Latin American FILAS, the Latin American Federation of Journalists. That, it was furnished by multiple organizations that were very much involved in UNESCO. And it is the most comprehensive and it has the most information regarding standards. It's important to read that. And we will read that for this, at the end of this book. Therefore, a study of this declaration is of importance in the education of journalists, both for professional training and lifelong education. So this declaration is important for the training of journalists. The U.S. doesn't have any training for journalists. The journalists, basically they, drop out of high school. They pick up a job at the Times, and now they're Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. That's the Yankee press. But real journalists from, most good countries like Asian, African, Latin American, and many European countries, they have a good press. They speak properly. They speak intellectually. They speak with facts. They don't just, renege or just, attack someone because of their race or some sort of, just propaganda. They don't institute a propaganda defamation against people. So the three chapters in part one are intended to help introducing the declaration to the programs of journalism training and in retaining it on the permanent agenda of professional debate. So the three chapters, you can read the chapters. It's basically, ethics of journalism. The third is the professional standards of journalism. Chapter 3 is the professional standards. Chapter 2 is the historical evidence of the declaration. And Chapter 1 outlines the international political context. Okay, Article 8 of the Declaration makes a direct appeal to the people who participate in the professional training of journalists and who assist them in performing their functions in a responsible manner should attach special importance to the principles of the Declaration when drawing up and ensuring application of their code of ethics. In fact, it is impossible to look at the Declaration in isolation from the general normative framework provided by so-called international law on the one hand, and from the nature and ethics of the profession of journalism on the other. So very good, description. And again, the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. That is our statement. That is what we are looking for. The context, a movement towards a new international information order. The media have not escaped a world in turmoil. These opening words in one of the by now innumerable publications on the Great Debate are symptomatic. Something threatening is happening in the world, which is inviting trouble in the field of journalism and mass communications. Surely this is a partisan view determined by a war between the free press and controlled press philosophies as the problem is defined from a typical Western perspective. The perspective of the developing countries as well as of the socialist countries of Eastern Europe is not nearly as gloomy. Rather, it presents a promising view of a world that can be changed for the better. Nevertheless, there is a world in turmoil, and it is generally agreed that worldwide the field of journalism and mass communication is in a state of crisis. The crisis surfaced during the 1970s in unforeseen intensity of activities, professional and scientific, as well as diplomatic, involve matters of communication in general and of international communication in particular. One of these reviews of these worldwide debate is illustrative of the major events, statements, and resolutions. It is reproduced as Appendix 27. Yet it is evident that the recent almost explosive attention to matters of international communication has a long history, extending at least to the origin of the United Nations, as well as illustrated in the chart in Appendix 27. In fact, it can be argued that the debate of the 1970s concerning a new international information order provides little that is genuinely new. For example, the problem of global imbalance of information, structure, and flows was recognized by the United Nations long before any great debate. The UN's Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, addressed the problems in 1961. See Item 5 in Appendix 27. 1 year later, the UN General Assembly expressed its concern over the fact that 70% of the population of the world lack adequate informational facilities and are thus denied effective enjoyment of the right to information, and invited governments of developed countries to cooperate with less developed countries with a view to meeting the urgent needs of the less developed countries in connection with a program for the development of independent and national information media with due regard for the culture of each country. Moreover, as early as 1952, a UN General Assembly resolution considered that it is essential for a proper development of public opinion in underdeveloped countries that independent domestic information enterprises should be given facilities and assistance in order that they may be enabled to contribute to the spread of information, to the development of national culture, and to international understanding, and continued that the time has arrived for the elaboration of a concrete program and plan of action in this respect. It is interesting, if not even ironic, that it took nearly 30 years before the UN system, through UNESCO, reacted to this appeal by mobilizing a major international program for the development of communications, IPDC, to be discussed later in this chapter. Why did it take such a long time before a major action was taken on a problem which had been recognized for decades? The review of development in and around UNESCO, which follows, provides an answer in two parts. First, there has been a gradual and fundamental change in the relations of social, economic, and political forces of the world with the establishment of the socialist countries of the Soviet Union and the rest of the Second World, and ending with the process of decolonization. In this decolonization, which created the developing countries of the Third World. In this situation, the capitalist countries of the First World, dominated by the United States, have gone on the defensive, faced with the overall challenge which was articulated in demands for a new order in the field of international communication, as well as in the world economy. Thus, the new international information order became an issue not so much because of the emergence of some drastically new phenomena, such as communication technology, but fundamentally because a sufficiently strong coalition of social forces had accumulated to enforce a new order, at least as a political program, even if not as an immediate reality. The struggle around a new international information order and the mass media declaration of UNESCO as an integral part of it no longer appears a distinct case, but rather is a reflection of conflicting socioeconomic political forces on a world scale. The media debate is indeed an integral part to a world of turmoil. Second, the setting up of the IPDC in 1980 as a manifestation of the new information order was an outcome of political tactics on the part of the U.S. and other Western powers. Material support for media facilities in the developing countries was supposed to reduce the force of political demands for a new order. The leading Western powers did not oppose such a transfer of resources to the underdeveloped world. On the contrary, they advocated it, since it was considered to be an effective means of diverting the demands for a new order. As put by the Western strategists themselves, its intention was trading ideology against cooperation. And certainly the main source of inspiration of this trade-off, quote unquote, was the mass media declaration supported by the Soviet-led front of the socialist and developing countries and perceived in the West as the most notorious of their proposals for a better information order promoted in lofty dimensions, which often proved to be cleverly disguised strategies to gain further control and regulation of the flow of news. Consequently, we are dealing with complex problems combining the long-term historical developments on a worldwide scale with a political maneuvering at a UN organization, UNESCO. In both respects, the mass media declaration have played a central role as a manifestation of a new power constellation in international relations whereby a third world socialist offensive has pushed the Western side into positions of reaction and retreat. Not surprisingly, the new information order appears to those who have vested interest in the old order as a bad idea that refuses to die. Equally logical is the enthusiasm with which the same idea is being entertained among those whose interests are at odds with the old order. The position held typically by advocates of the developing and socialist countries has been well expressed by UNESCO Director General, for whom the new order is an idea whose time is near. In his review, the mass media declaration comprises a contribution of the highest importance to preparing people for the advent of a new information order. In order to properly appreciate this situation, it is necessary to keep in mind the fact that the foundations of UNESCO was an outcome of predominantly Western activity in 1945, and that it was the United States that stressed the paramount importance of the media in spreading knowledge and common understanding for security. After having introduced communication component to the Constitution, the U.S. proposed at the first session of the General Conference, UNESCO's highest decision-making body, that UNESCO should establish a worldwide communication system worth some $250 million. The proposal was turned down largely due to the resistance by the British, who feared that the U.S. would use UNESCO to blitz the world with American ideas. That's the British. The British are scared about the blitz of the Yankee, fraud, the Yankee missiles of lies. However, as Joseph Meehan showed in his review of U.S. UNESCO history, the U.S. continued pursuing this approach, producing material for UNESCO radio programming that even friendly editorial comment in Western Europe called American propaganda. The Polish delegate at the 1947 General Conference introduced a resolution urging UNESCO to take legal measures to put the mass information at the sole disposal of friendly international cooperation, which would render impossible any activity hostile to such cooperation. The Polish initiative, however, did not succeed after Senator Benton rose to denounce it. The same situation prevailed in the 1950s. When the Korean War began, the United States stepped up the efforts to have its viewpoints promoted in all UNESCO communications media. U.S. newspapers supported this effort with headlines such as U.S. looks for UNESCO to tell Korea truth, and UNESCO aid sought along the propaganda front. In response, the London News Chronicle editorialized American insistence that UNESCO enter the Cold War by spreading pro-Western, anti-communist propaganda is producing a crisis which may wreck the organization. While UNESCO's activities were criticized frequently by the world press as reflecting too strongly U.S. foreign policy ideologies, the Associated Press story at that time quoted Senator Benton denouncing UNESCO's aloofness and demanding that it recognize its role as a political instrument of the Cold War. The U.S. action did not succeed in turning UNESCO into a political instrument of the Cold War. Yet by the early 1960s, the organization was extremely popular in the U.S., particularly among intellectuals and the media. As Meehan put it, but in the turbulent decade of the 60s, with some 70 former colonies gained their independence, their relationship between the United States and UNESCO cooled considerably. The relationship between the United States and UNESCO cooled considerably. That's in this, after the 1960s started. Obviously, the changes in the global relations of socio-political forces that caused the turbulence of the 1960s also determined the shift of official U.S. policy toward UNESCO from action to reaction. And one should not forget that these changes were not only a consequence of the decolonization of the Third World, but also the fact that a socialist Second World was consolidated and became more active in the international arena. Thus, as shown by Wolfgang Kleinwacher, the Soviet Union's entry into UNESCO in 1954 was reflected by 1956 at the 9th session of the General Conference of New Delhi, where a resolution passed inviting member states to direct the mass media toward the cause of peace and international understanding. In 1960, the 11th session of the General Conference in Paris even demanded that steps be taken against war propaganda and in support of the UN efforts towards disarmament. On the other hand, at the 15th session of the General Conference in Paris, 1968, the USSR did not succeed in having a convention introduced to the effect of prohibiting the use of the mass media for propagating militarism, revanchism, hatred among people, and racial discrimination. We now focus on the specific developments which make up the movement towards a new international information order of the 1970s. So excellent section. That's the first section toward the context, a movement toward a new international information order, chapter 1. We're going to make some comments. And so again, the goal of my presentations is that the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO, and we'll make targeted comments with respect to this. Okay, the media have not escaped a world in turmoil. The opening words in one of the innumerable publications of the Great Debate are symptomatic. Something threatening is happening to the world, which is inviting trouble in the field of journalism and mass communications. Truly, this is a partisan view determined by a war between the free press and controlled press philosophies, as the problem is defined from a typically Western perspective. Okay, so the free press is the Western press. That's the U.S. government press. It's U.S. mass media and some of the bigger Western governments that have a similar press to the United States. They don't like anything but a free press and they don't like controlled free press philosophies. All right, controlled free press philosophies, they're basically controlled press philosophies indicate that you have to control, you have to be socially accountable for the information. That's all it means. Controlled press philosophies means there needs to be social restraint on the part of the free press. And the U.S. doesn't like that. The Western governments, or whoever the U.S. is directing, there are some Western governments that are part of it, do not like any control, any social control on what they want to say, because they want to imperialize. Remember, the UNESCO brings a dichotomy into existence immediately. It's the West, the United States, Britain, France, and the colonial powers, and the Third World, who were colonies. So the colonies, or the decolonization of UNESCO, was the priority. The West wanted, their own information, because the white man needs to, propagandize. Otherwise, the colonies aren't going to like the white man, right? They knew what they did to their brothers and sisters. So the Third World is going to say, hell with you. We don't want to hear your stuff. And that's what happened to the West. The West got upset because the Third World was saying, we don't want to hear what you have to say, white man. We want the truth, and we want it published as the truth. And that's why the U.S. doesn't like that. They are the propagandists of the West, and they want to, create this, anger against the Third World, because they believe they should be able to disseminate all the fraud to the Third World and, lie and cheat and tell them what they want them to know, not what the truth is. And that's what the real argument here is. The perspective of the developing countries, as well as that of the social countries of Eastern Europe, is not nearly as gloomy. Rather, it presents a promising view of a world that can be changed for the better. Nevertheless, there's a world in turmoil, and it is generally agreed that worldwide the field of journalism and mass media is in a state of crisis. So, it's the crisis of the mass media. All right, so the global imbalance, there was obviously global imbalance of information because of this, Western approach and the Third World approach for truthful and socially controlled information that reflects all the ideas, all the viewpoints, and that was embodied by the ECOSOC meeting of 1961. 70% of the population of the world lack adequate information facilities and are thus denied effective enjoyment of the right to information. And they invited governments of developed countries to cooperate with less developed countries with a view to meeting the urgent needs of the less developed countries in connection with this program for the development of the independent national information media with due regard for the culture of each country. As early as 1952, a UN General Assembly resolution considered that it is essential for a proper development of public opinion in underdeveloped countries that independent domestic information enterprises should be given facilities and assistance in order that they may be enabled to contribute to the spread of information, to the development of national culture, and to international understanding, and continued that the time has arrived for the elaboration of concrete programs and the plan of action in this respect. So there was the ECOSOC meeting of the UN in 1961, didn't require, but it advised the Western governments to produce an information order for which the Third World countries, of the decolonized countries, the countries that had just been decolonized due to British, French, and American, imperialism, giving them independence and sovereignty, they wanted an information order that was truthful and socially responsible. And that was reflected in the ECOSOC meeting of the UN. So continuing, it is interesting, if not ironic, that it took nearly 30 years before the UN system through UNESCO reacted to this appeal by mobilizing a major international program for the development of the communications, IPDC. Why did it take such a long time before the major action was taken on the problem, which has been recognized for decades? Okay, so IPDC, that's the IPDC, the International Communications Declaration. We're going to get to that. But the IPDC is an organization that was created to allow for, a proper UNESCO assessment of information order. Okay, there is a change in relation of social, economic, and political forces in the world, beginning with the establishment of the socialist countries, the Soviet Union, and the rest of the Second World, and ending with the process of decolonization, which created the developing countries of the third world. In this situation, the capitalist, quote unquote, countries of the first world, quote unquote, dominated by the United States, have gone on the defensive, faced with an overall challenge which was articulated by the demands for a new order in the field of international communications as well as in the world economy. So, we said the decolonization, the United States is in the first world and the third world would decolonize. And so this dichotomy creates a reactionary action on the part of the U.S. government and its media system towards UNESCO and third world requirements for information flow. Thus, the new international information order became an issue not so much because of the emergence of some drastically new phenomena such as communication technology, but fundamentally because a sufficiently strong coalition of social forces had accumulated to enforce a new order, at least a political program, even if not an immediate reality. Thus, the struggle around a new international information order and the mass media declaration of UNESCO as an integral part of it no longer appears as a distinct case, but rather as a reflection of continuing conflicting socioeconomic political forces on a world scale. The media debate is an integral part of the world in turmoil. So they wanted a new order, okay? Basically new international information order that provided a proper philosophical media, ideas, proper ideas of the media. The setting up of the IPDC in 1980, remember, it was 1980 when the IPDC is set up, as a manifestation of the new information order was an outcome of political tactics on the part of the U.S. and other Western powers. Material support for media facilities in the developing countries was supposed to reduce the force of the political demands for a new order. The leading Western powers did not oppose such a transfer of resources to the underdeveloped world. On the contrary, they advocated it, since it was considered to be an effective means of diverting the demands for a new order. As put by the Western strategists themselves, the intention was trading ideology against cooperation. So you can see that's the key point. That's the Yankees, the U.S. government, and trading ideology against cooperation, right? So, we'll give you the money. We'll give you the nice facilities to print the media. But you have to print what we say, right? That's the goal of the U.S. government. They are propagandists. They are liars. They are outright liars. They are suppressors. They have selective reporters. They are biased reporters. They are, basically, undiverse, unbalanced coverage. They need to be expelled from UNESCO because they are putting forth an idea of we force the ideology on the third world, and the third world has to accept our ideology or go to hell. That's the U.S. government statement. They need to be expelled from UNESCO. That is not a free information order. That is a U.S. government propaganda ministry. So continuing on, and certainly the main source of information for this trade-off was the mass media declaration, supported by the Soviet-led Front of Socialist and Developing Countries, and perceived in the West as the most notorious of their proposals for a better information order, promoted in lofty dimensions, which often proved to be cleverly disguised strategies to gain further control and regulation of flow of the news. So the West obviously was, on a reactionary, just a reactionary, propagandist, thought process that, the Soviets, with respect to the mass media declaration, were, basically clearly disguising strategies to gain further control and regulate the flow of news, right? But the West lies, right? We talked about all the things the West does. They have blatant bias. They have, RAMBO, hit and run journalism. They have violent journalism. They have fabrication, facts, suppression, selective reporting, and, outright lies. So obviously, you need to have social control of news. And the Hutchins Commission put it out in 1945, said very specifically, you need social responsibility to news. It is the responsibility of journalists to know what is fact and what is fiction, and the U.S. press doesn't have that knowledge. They don't know how to distinguish it. So they need to be expelled from UNESCO. So consequently, we are dealing with a complex problem combining long-term historical developments on a worldwide scale with political maneuvering at a UN organization, UNESCO. In both respects, the mass media declaration has played a central role as a manifestation of a new power constellation in international relations, whereby a third world socialist offensive has pushed the Western side into positions of reaction and retreat. So you can see the Western governments were pushed into the retreat by, the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc of socialist nations that were looking for a reliable, socially accountable information order. You see, just news is not, is not the crux. Socially acceptable, reliable news for which the viewpoints are screened and kicked out if they're not, acceptable is correct news. And the West doesn't do that. The West propagandizes. Whatever they say, whatever their government says, goes. It is a hierarchy. The white man at the top, the corporate white man at the top, decides what gets printed and what ideology is pushed. Whereas in the Soviet system or the Eastern system, the socially accountability, if there are 8 billion people, 8 billion people decide whether this is the correct statement about this group of people. Okay, if there is a targeting of the East Timorese people or the Latin American Chilean people by the Western press, 8 billion people decide whether the Chileans are actually guilty of the statements made in this white man's state by this white man. Whereas the Western press just puts the statement, the Timorese are crazy. The Chileans need to be, disciplined. The Chileans need to be disciplined because they're criminals. That is the white Yankee press. And that is why they don't have the right to be in UNESCO, because they don't subscribe to socially accountable press the way the Eastern Bloc does and the Third World does. This is a Third World Eastern Bloc socialist block of countries, and they have a proper press, whereas the Yankee press is just one white man decides what is printed and what is not what is true and what is not true, and that truth is propaganda of the U.S. ministry of fraud. So so consequently, we are dealing with a complex problem, combining long-term historical developments on a world. Okay, so not surprisingly, the new information order appears to those who have vested interest in the old order as a bad idea that refuses to die. Equally logical is the enthusiasm with which the same idea is entertained among those whose interests are at odds with the old order. The position held typically by advocates of the developing and socialist countries had been well expressed by UNESCO's Director General, to whom the new order is an idea whose time is near. In his review, the mass media declaration comprises a contribution of highest importance to preparing people for the advent of new information order. So the new information order is what Amadar Matau was stating and the mass media declaration. Okay, so in order to properly appreciate the situation, it is necessary to keep in mind the fact that the formation of UNESCO was an outcome of predominantly Western activity in 1945, and that it was the United States that stressed the paramount importance of the media in spreading knowledge and common understanding for security. After having introduced the communication component of the Constitution, the U.S. proposed at the first session of the General Conference, UNESCO's highest decision-making body, that UNESCO should establish a worldwide communication system worth some $250 million. This proposal was turned down largely due to resistance by the British, who feared that the U.S. would use UNESCO to blitz the world with American ideas. That's the absolute truth. I mean, I don't know what the ideas were at that time, but the U.S., government and the U.S. media, they just blitz the world with American fraud. Okay, they just, throw out lies. We talked about it. There are missiles of lies. Fraud missile 1, fabrication missile 2, lie missile 3, suppression missile 4, omission missile 5, falsification missile 6, fabrication missile 7, unbalanced missiles 8, 9, and 10, then selective reporting 10, 11, and 12, and then it's all done, right? Everybody has no clue what's going on. That's the U.S. press. They need to be expelled from UNESCO. So the same situation prevailed into the 1950s. When the Korean War began, the United States stepped up efforts to have its viewpoints promoted in all UNESCO communications media. U.S. newspapers supported the effort with headlines such as U.S. looks to tell UNESCO to tell Korea truth, and UNESCO's aid sought along the propaganda front. In response, London News Chronicle editorialized American insistence that UNESCO enter the Cold War by spreading pro-Western anti-communist propaganda is producing a crisis which may wreck the organization. Basically, the idea was like the North Koreans were, basically responsible for the Korean War. That was the propaganda that the U.S. wanted to spread. That is a lie. That is an outright lie. That is a fabrication and falsification of high proportions. They used their clout at the UN. They used their clout in UNESCO to fabricate the truth, which is that the United States instilled the attack. South Korea attacked North Korea in this demilitarized zone, for which the United States didn't, investigate, didn't verify the sources. And so because of that attack, the North Koreans responded and went into South Korea. And for that, the U.S. wanted UNESCO to lie. And that they did, put out a resolution. And this was all established because remember, before the Korean War, around the time of the Korean War, there was no third world majority. Okay, the U.S. had majority in the UN automatically because they were white majority. Okay, they were all colonies. Everybody was a colony, and all the colonies still hadn't been freed. So it was all white majority. All the Western governments had the majority. So the Korean War is based on a white majority, and it is a fraudulent war propaganda machine. The U.S. government created the Korean War conflict and stated that North Korea invaded South Korea, which was fabrication. And the war was actually McCarthy's war, the U.S. government's war against North Korea. And they were warring against China as well. They dragged China into the conflict, and they didn't even include China. China wasn't even in the UN in 1953. So all of these things, the U.S. used these international organizations as a tool of politicization, for which they need to be expelled from UNESCO. That use of UNESCO as a tool for politicization and the use of UN as a tool for politicization are examples of why the U.S. uses these organizations as a political tool. And then when it becomes, and voting equal majority, voting of the third world, they dispute it and they want white majority rule. They need to be expelled from UNESCO. So continue on. The U.S. action did not succeed in turning UNESCO to a political instrument of the Cold War. Yet by the early 1960s, the World Organization was extremely popular in the U.S., particularly among intellectuals and the media, as Meehan put it. But in the turbulent decade of the 60s, when some 70 former colonies gained their independence, the relationship between the United States and UNESCO cooled considerably. So you can see when the U.S. had automatic majority in the 50s, they were fine, right? I mean, when you can, just make the rule, you just say Korea launched the attack. Korea needs to be attacked. We need to bomb Korea. And they did that. They did that. They bombed them to death. Okay, they turned North Korea to dust in 1950 to 1953. Okay, and, because they can use it as a tool, because they're automatic majority, they can just lie and put out whatever propaganda they want. Now they need to be checked, right? But now when they get checked, they get angry, right? The Yankees are very hot-tempered Yankee whites. They're short-tempered Yankee white rapist butchers. And so when they get angry, they can't, agree. So they cooled their, relationship with UNESCO in the 1960s after decolonization. Okay, so thus, as shown by Wolfgang Kleinwachter, the Soviet Union's entry into UNESCO in 1954 was reflected by 1956 at the ninth session of the General Conference in New Delhi, where a resolution was passed inviting member states to direct the mass media toward the cause of peace and international understanding. So the Soviet Union asked for the mass media be directed toward peace and international understanding. In 1960, the 11th session of the General Conference in Paris even demanded that steps be taken against war propaganda and in support of the UN efforts toward disarmament. On the other hand, at the 15th session of the General Conference in Paris, the USSR did not succeed in having a convention introduced to the effect of prohibiting the use of the mass media for propagating militarism, revanchism, hatred among peoples, and racial discrimination. These are things that the U.S. wanted, right? The U.S. was for militarism, revanchism, hatred among peoples, and racial discrimination. So that's why the USSR could not succeed, because, the Western Bloc prevented that General Conference from succeeding, because the Western Bloc has enough votes to be able to do that. We now focus on the specific developments which make up the movements toward a new international information order in the 1970s. Strategies in the 1970s. Forces in confrontation. At least three different, although partially overlapping strategic designs or stages can be discerned in the development of the global relation of forces during the 1970s in the field of communication policies, as well as the grand designs of world political strategies. The first occupying the early 1970s until 1976 dominated by an offensive on the part of the developing countries against the industrialized West. The second stage might be characterized as a Western counterattack of the self-defensive nature, which peaked around 1976 to 1977. The third strategic situation emerged soon after the second and was highlighted on a number of occasions in 1978, including the adoption of the Mass Media Declaration. It might be described as a stage of tactical maneuvering in a spirit of compromise. Naturally, such an outline cannot do justice to all aspects of reality. To particular, one should not forget that this history does not begin and end with these stages, but that they constitute only small cycles of broader transition and long-term process. So strategies in the 1970s, forces in confrontation. And so basically, the field of communication policies and grand design of the world political strategies was, first, from the early 1970s until 1976, is dominated by an offensive on the part of developing countries against the industrialized West. The second stage might be characterized as the counterattack of a self-defensive nature, which peaked around 1976 to 77. The third strategic situation emerged soon after the second and was highlighted on a number of occasions in 1978, including the adoption of a Mass Media Declaration. It might be described as a stage of tactical maneuvering in the spirit of compromise. So basically, finally in 1978, there was a compromise, and they adopted the Mass Media Declaration. And that compromise was not acceptable to the United States. So the United States withdrew, and they actually got the British to also withdraw from UNESCO in 1984. Naturally, such an outline. Okay, so let's decolonization offensive. This is very important. This is about decolonization, the whole offensive of the newly decolonized states. The first of these three stages was the logical continuation of the decolonization process, which accelerated in the 1960s. Herbert Schiller has characterized the emergence of this situation in these apt words. The idyllic picture of a world coming together culturally and economically under the benign auspices of American capitalism began to blister and crack in the late 1960s. A combination of development-focused attention on what the conditions actually were behind the glossy images that were circulated by the powerful Western communications machinery. Many new nations found that their economies remain as feeble and as dependent as ever. The victorious but devastating wars of national liberation by the peoples of Korea, Algeria, Cuba, Indochina, Angola, and Mozambique revealed the extent to which imperialists would go to hold on to their privileged positions. Finally, the appearance of a new powerful communications technology, satellite communication, provided instantaneous worldwide transmissions. The potential, together with the experience that had been accumulated from 25 years exposure to United States media outputs, set off alarm signals across the ocean. What might be expected from an American corporate-controlled communication satellite system, free to beam its transmissions into any spot or home across the globe? By the early 1970s, the developing countries had accumulated a great deal of political power and economic potential with the assistance of such organizations as the Movement of Non-Aligned Countries and OPEC. All this created a new relation of forces in the world arena, already under pressure from the socialist part of the world, leading to such manifestations as the oil crisis and the UN Declaration of the New International Economic Order, all of which worked against the vested interests of the Western world order. Another non-corollary to this offensive of the underdog against the West was a polarization of the Arab-Israeli conflict, reflected not only in a war between the parties, but also in their UN resolutions, by which the majority of the international community defined Zionism as a form of racism. In this situation, it appeared that a new chapter in world history was in the making, and it was not by chance that the phrase New Order became popular. After all, it implies a radical analysis of the world. The concept of order points at a global structure not far from Lenin's theory of imperialism. Beyond this, it suggests a radical program to change the world. The old notion of new may be well interpreted as a call for war against the old order. Consequently, the basic pattern was that the West was on the defensive and the developing countries, supported by the socialist countries, were on the offensive. As a political program and an intellectual concept, decolonization was well established in the early 70s, legitimized by the authority of the UN. But before 1973, the idea of decolonization was not applied in and articulated in an authoritative manner to the sphere of information and culture. This occurred in the Fourth Conference of the Heads of State of Government of the non-aligned countries in Algiers, attended by 75 members of the non-aligned movement. The political declaration of the conference made the point that the activities of imperialism are not confined solely to the economic and political fields, but also cover cultural and social fields, and demanded concerted actions in the fields of mass communication as part of the action program for economic cooperation. The initiative launched in Algiers was carried forward in 1975 at the Ministerial Conference of the Non-Aligned Countries in Lima, Peru, where the attending 81 foreign ministers adopted a special resolution on cooperation in the field of diffusion of information and mass communications in the media. In the same year, a pool of press agencies of the non-aligned countries started its operation on the coordination of the Yugoslavian National News Agency, Tanjung. The real breakthrough of the ideas of information decolonization took place in 1976. In March, the Non-Aligned Symposium of Information in Tunisia, attended by 38 member states and 13 observers, laid down a political framework for the emancipation of the developing countries from the structures of imperialist power. The phrase New International Order was applied to information there. Since information in the world shows a disequilibrium favoring some and ignoring others, it is the duty of non-aligned countries and other developing countries to change this situation and obtain decolonization of information, to initiate a new international order in information. In July 1976, the Conference on Press Agencies, pool of the non-aligned countries, met in New Delhi, India, for the first time at high political levels of ministers of information. The ministers from 59 non-aligned countries prepared the constitution for the pool and issued a landmark statement, the New Delhi Declaration, which contains a sharp analysis of the existing international order as justification of the demands for a new order. The present global information flows are marked by a serious inadequacy and imbalance. The means of communicating information are concentrated in a few countries. The great majority of countries are reduced to being passive recipients of information which is disseminated from a few centers. This situation perpetuates the colonial era of dependence and domination. It confines judgments and decisions on what should be known and how it should be made known into the hands of a few. The dissemination of information rests at present in the hands of a few agencies located in a few developed countries, and the rest of the peoples of the world are forced to see each other and even themselves through the medium of these agencies. Just as political and economic dependencies are legacies of colonialism, so is the case of dependence in the field of information, which in turn retards the achievement of political and economic growth. In a situation where the means of information are dominated and monopolized by a few, freedom of information really comes to mean freedom of these few to propagate the information in the manner of their choosing, and in the virtual denial of the rest of the right to inform and be informed objectively and accurately. Non-aligned countries have, in particular, been the victims of this phenomenon. Their endeavors, individual or collective, for world peace, justice, and for the establishment of an equitable international economic order have been underplayed or misrepresented by the international news media. Their unity has sought to be eroded. Their efforts to safeguard their political and economic independence and stability has been denigrated. The declaration was endorsed by the highest authority of the non-aligned movement, the Fifth Conference of the Heads of State of Government of Non-Aligned Countries, which met in Colombo, Sri Lanka in August 1976, and the participation of 87 members of the non-aligned movement. The Colombo Summit also legitimized demands for a new order. A new international order in the fields of information and mass communication is as vital as a new international economic order. Non-aligned countries noted with the concern the vast and ever-growing gap between communication capacities in non-aligned countries and the advanced countries, which is a legacy of their colonial past. This has created the situation of dependence and domination in which the majority of countries are reduced to being passive recipients of biased, inadequate, and distorted information. The fuller identification of their national and cultural identity thus required them to rectify this serious imbalance and to take urgent steps to provide greater momentum in the new area of mutual cooperation. The emancipation and developments of national information media is an integral part of the overall struggle for political, economic, and social independence, and for a large majority of the peoples of the world who should not be denied the right to inform us and be informed objectively and correctly. So that's the decolonization offensive. Very important to understand the decolonization offensive and understand the colonial Yankees. The Yankees are a colonial regime. They're a colonial anti-third world group. They need to be expelled from UNESCO. The United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO for fostering colonialism and imperialism and waging war against the third world. So let's go through the decolonization. The idyllic picture of a world coming together culturally and economically under the benign auspices of American capitalism began to blister and crack in the late 1960s. A combination of development-focused attention on what the conditions were behind the glossy images that were circulated in the powerful Western communications machinery. Many new nations found their economies remained as feeble and dependent as ever. The victorious but devastating wars of national liberation by the peoples of Korea, Algeria, Cuba, Indochina, Angola, and Mozambique revealed the extent to which imperialists would go to hold on to their privileged positions. So you can see, basically, American capitalism, American imperialism, American colonialism was meant to keep in check the third world peoples. And it was, the examples of the Korean War, the Algerian conflict, Cuban independence, Indochina, Angola, and Mozambique. Okay, Korean War, it was an oppressive war of butchery by the Yankees, the Yankee rapist butchers, the short-tempered whites, caused a huge casualty count in the Korean War. Up to 1 million Koreans were slaughtered by Yankee bombs, Yankee napalm, and Yankee, cluster bombs and radioactive bombs and biological weaponry and chemical weaponry. So remember that. That was the Korean War. Also the war in Algeria. That was the War of Algeria for Algerian independence. The French, they were trying to keep the French in power in Algeria. The United States was behind it. And the Algerians, overthrew the French, colony and took control. Cuba, we know about Cuba. Castro, he led a revolution against Batista, the tyrant Batista, the American imperialist. He took over and he was in power for many years. And Cuba is still independent. Indochina, one of the most abysmal conflicts of American imperialism. The Yankees unloaded napalm, cluster bombs, radioactive munitions, biological weapons, poison, white phosphorus, sarin gas. All of these things were used against the Asians in Indochina. The United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO for fostering colonialism against the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Asia and Africa and the Americas. Okay, the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO for these things. Okay, we also know about Angola and Mozambique. Angola again. Angola was given independence by Portugal, and they were withdrawing. And at that time, the United States teamed up with Zaire, an imperialist Zairean dictator, Mobutu, as well as the South African racist regime, to keep the blacks of Angola and Mozambique in a oppressive stranglehold and a perennial colonial state. And that is what the United States did. For all of these things, the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO because their interest in colonialism and propagating colonies against the third world. So continuing on. So finally, the appearance of a new powerful communications technology satellite communication provided instantaneous worldwide transmission, the potential taken together with the experience that had been accumulated from 25 years exposure to United States media outputs set off an alarm across the oceans. What might be expected for an American corporate-controlled communication satellite system free to beam its transmission to any spot or home across the globe? So you can see immediately the newly decolonized nations got very concerned that the United States had its technology, satellite communications, and instantaneous worldwide transmission that could basically beam its corporate controlled communication all through any spot or home in the globe. So they were looking to create a new information order, which got rid of that order. So continuing on, all this created basically OPEC. We talked about OPEC. The developing countries had accumulated a great deal of political power and economic potential with the assistance of such organizations of the movement of non-aligned countries and OPEC. All this created the new relations and forces in the world arena, already under pressure from the socialist part of the world, leading to such manifestations as the oil crisis and the UN declaration of the new international economic order, all of which worked against the vested interests of the Western world order. Right, so that's an important fact. Another corollary to this offensive of the underdog against the West was a polarization of the Arab-Israeli conflict, reflected not only in a war between the parties, but also in the UN resolution by which a majority of the international community defines Zionism as a form of racism. So the oil crisis and the UN declaration of the new international economic order worked against the vested interests of the Western world order, and that's where UNESCO came in. There was a radical program to change the world by the third world. The notion of new may well be interpreted as a call for war against the old order. Consequently, the basic pattern was that the West was on the defensive and the developing countries, supported by the socialist countries, were on the offensive. So the U.S. was concerned by the war, not a military war, but an ideologic war, a war in which the third world was putting its principles down for anti-colonialism, anti-racism, anti-apartheid, and for a new information order that would present socially accountable news, not U.S. colonial fraud news. That's what the U.S. was presenting as a political program and an intellectual concept. Decolonization was well established by the early 70s. Legitimized by the authority of the UN. But before 1973, the idea of decolonization was not applied in an articulated, authoritative manner to the sphere of information and culture. This occurred in the fourth conference of the heads of state of government of the non-aligned countries in Algiers, attended by 75 members of the non-aligned movement. The political declaration of the conference made the point that the activities of imperialism are not confined solely to the political and economic fields, but also cover the cultural and social fields, and demanded concerted action in the fields of mass communication as part of the action program for economic cooperation. So you can see the fourth conference of Algiers, basically the activities of imperialism. The Yankee imperialists were already looked at. They're not confined solely to the political and economic fields, but they were facing cultural and social imperialism through their media, through their mass media and their cultural imperialism. The non-aligned movement demanded concerted actions in the field of mass communication as a part of the action program for economic cooperation. Okay, so we talked also about the free press. The pool of press agencies in the non-aligned countries started its operation under the coordination of the Yugoslavian news agency Tanjung. Okay, the Algiers conference, ministerial conference of non-aligned countries in Peru was attended by 81 foreign ministers, adopted a special resolution of cooperation in the field of the diffusion of information and mass communication. So it was a very important topic. These are very important topics. In March, the Non-Aligned Symposium of Information in Tunis, attended by 38 member states and 13 observers, laid down a political framework for the emancipation of the developing countries from the structures of imperialist power. The phrase new international order was first applied to information there. So basically, structures of imperialist power laid down a political framework. 38 member states in the Non-Aligned Symposium of Information in Tunisia in 1976, the Information Decolonization, conference took place. and they wanted emancipation of the developing countries from the structures of imperialist power. So basically, it was basically an electronic colonialism. It was a electronic communications colonialism dependence that the United States was fostering in the third world. And that was their goal. Their goal was to keep the third world oppressed with colonial news and, keep them dependent on colonial ideas and ideology. For these reasons, the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. The United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. Sources of information in the world shows a disequilibrium favoring some and ignoring others. It is the duty of the non-aligned countries and the other developing countries to change the situation and obtain decolonization of information and initiate a new international order of information. Okay, then we talked about, basically the new information order was the important, and it was, basically a disequilibrium favoring the colonialists and ignoring the developing third world. So that the duty of the non-aligned nations was to obtain decolonization of information and initiate a new international order in socially acceptable information, a socially agreed upon information order. So then in July 1976, there was the Conference of Press Agencies Pool of the non-aligned countries meeting in New Delhi. And, for the first time in high political ministers of information, 59 non-aligned countries prepared the constitution for the pool and issued a landmark declaration. Basically, the New Delhi Declaration contains a sharp analysis of the existing international order as the justification of the demands for a new order. The present global information flows are marked by a serious inadequacy and imbalance. The means of communicating information are concentrated in a few countries. The great majority of countries are reduced to being passive recipients of information, which is disseminated from a few centers. That is the Yankee press. That is who is issuing these ideas. The U.S. mass media is issuing their, the ideas, and it is problematic for the non-aligned countries. The situation perpetuates the colonial era of dependence and domination. It confines judgments and decisions on what should be known and how it should be made known into the hands of a few. So the few colonialists, the Yankees in the Western press, I think the British and the French press were part of this. These three countries were controlling the flow of information across their colonial countries, their colonial states, which they had freed for independence, forcing them into a situation of further colonialism, further dependency on the colonialists for information, for which the third world was acting against. They were, basically waging a war against this campaign by the West to keep the colonies in a state of oppression. And the U.S. led this onslaught, including Britain and France and the other Western Bloc nations. Okay, so the dissemination of information rests at present in the hands of a few agencies located in a few developed countries, and the rest of the peoples of the world are forced to see each other and even themselves through the medium of these agencies. Just as political and economic dependencies are legacies of eras of colonialism, so is the case of dependence in the field of information, which in turn retards the achievement of political and economic growth. So again, they were using the new information economic order. They were using their, economic dependency and colonial information order to prevent growth and economic development and growth in the third world nations. Okay, and all of the agencies were present in small number of Western countries. Few developed countries, maybe France, England, the United States, Portugal, Netherlands. These were the places where the agencies were sitting that were disseminating the press. So that was obviously not helpful. And the Yankees were leading the charge. The U.S. government was leading the charge. So basically, in a situation where the means of information are dominated and monopolied by a few, the monopoly by a few, the means of this information are dominated and monopolized by a few. Freedom of information really comes to mean the freedom of these few to propagate information, manner of their choosing, and their virtual denial to the rest of the world, the right to inform and be informed objectively and accurately. So they could propagate any information, freedom of the few to propagate any propaganda to the third world in a manner of their choosing, and the denial of the rest of the right to inform and be informed objectively and accurately. So, like we said, they can you lie, just outright lies. It can go to the third world, and it's fine. That's because it's coming from the Western press. The Western press is, fostering the colonial dependence on their press, and they're throwing the lies out to further their colonialism. And they want to just make war in one place, so they put out propaganda against Iran, and then they go to war. If they want to make war against Venezuela, they put out propaganda about drug terrorism of an honest and decent man in Venezuela, and they go to war and kidnap him like rapist, butcher, short-tempered Yankee whites. So, non-aligned countries have, in particular, been the victims of this phenomena. Their endeavors, individual or collective, for world peace, justice, and for the establishment of an equitable international economic order have been underplayed or misrepresented by international news media. Their unity has sought to be eroded. Their efforts to safeguard their political and economic independence and stability have been denigrated. So basically, the economic order, basically the endeavors, individual or collective, world peace, justice, and establishment of equitable international economic order have been underplayed or misrepresented by international news media. So they are saying that the international news media is biased. The international news media is suppressive. The international news media is misrepresenting the truthful information. And so they need a new news media. Okay, then we talked about the Colombo Summit in August 1976. The heads of government of non-aligned countries, a new international economic order was demanded, and mass communications is as vital as a new international economic order. Information and mass communication order is as vital as a new international economic order. Non-aligned countries noted with concern the vast and ever-growing gap between communications capacity in non-aligned countries and the advanced countries, which is a legacy of their colonial past. Okay, the vast and ever-growing gap in communication capacities between non-aligned countries and the advanced developing countries, a product of their colonial past. This has created a situation of dependence and domination in which the majority of countries are reduced to being passive recipients of biased, inadequate, and distorted information. So you can see biased, distorted, and inadequate. So we talked about bias and distortion. That's the U.S. mass media. That's the Western press. The U.S. mass media and Western press are biased and distorted pieces of information. So the fuller identification and affirmation of their national and cultural identity thus required them to rectify this serious imbalance and to take urgent steps to provide greater momentum in the new area of mutual cooperation. Okay, so basically they wanted, immediate steps to avoid national and cultural identity, basically national and cultural identity erasure from the third world. Okay, so the emancipation and the development of national information media is an integral part to the overall struggle for political, economic, and social independence for a large majority of the peoples of the world, and should not be denied the right to inform and to be informed objectively and correctly. So objective, correct news is what the third world was looking for. The United States was looking for a propaganda show of its U.S. mass media and its Western allies in, propagating fraud, lies against the third world. And that is what the U.S. mass media does. The United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. The United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. New professional perspectives. Let's continue. I'm going to just take a short break. Glad you could join us today. Okay, we'll finish with this one. It'll put us on page 15, the Western counterattack. Yeah, we'll try to finish with the Western counterattack. I'll try to get to page 16. So I'll be right back. Okay, new professional perspectives. Related to this overall political development was a gradual change in perspective, which could be noticed beginning in the late 1960s in the academic community of communication scholars, not only in the developing countries, but above all in the West. It was a reorientation of the theoretical approaches, beginning with self-critical awareness of how non-political research had in fact promoted conservative mass media policies, and ending with a fundamental reappraisal of the scientific world outlook or paradigm which had dominated the tradition of communication research in the West. Since this tradition was mainly made in the USA, the emerging critical school of thought alienated scholars from American authorities who, until the late 1960s, had enjoyed virtual hegemony in this field of study across all over the world, with the exception of socialist countries with their Marxist-Leninist approach. And the more the critical orientation departed from the U.S. mainstream, the more versatile became the field of study, where some Marxist scholars also found a legitimate place. The new orientation in the political as well as the academic sphere were brought together by UNESCO at the meeting of experts on mass communication and society, convened in Montreal, Canada, in June 1969. The meeting, attended not only by radical advocates of a new academic approach, but also by well-known authorities of the established American tradition, ended up with a fairly critical assessment of the state of the art, challenging, among other things, the doctrine of the free flow of information, and urging communication scholars to adopt a more committed policy orientation in favor of democratic mass media structures under conditions of cultural identity and national sovereignty. On the basis of the Montreal meeting, the General Conference of UNESCO launched a program for studies on the effects of communications on society of 1970, leading in 1971 to the proposals for an international program of communications research. As far as the communication policies are concerned, UNESCO produced the Report of Meeting of Experts on Communication Policies and Planning, a conceptual document which underlines the importance of research in the formulation of policies and the development of planning strategies to produce communication systems which are functional and fulfill the communication needs of society. Among the several projects which followed these UNESCO exercises was a worldwide study of television program structures and flows, as well as a symposium to digest the findings of this inventory, organized at the University of Tampere in Finland. Accordingly, UNESCO served as a central forum for the articulation and mobilization of a new policy-oriented generation of communication research. But it would be misleading to understand the new perspective as a creation of UNESCO. All that UNESCO did was to facilitate the expression of certain political and intellectual tendencies of the day. Thus, accusations that the UNESCO Secretariat was infiltrated by anti-Western elements who then instigated a radical line in the organization's communication program are ill-founded. An objective analysis of the geographic and political backgrounds and of the professional performance of the staff in the Secretariat will show, if anything, it was biased toward an overall Western approach, which in fact has given rise to the concept of a, quote, Anglo-Saxon mafia operating within UNESCO. So remember, you need to expel the Anglo-Saxon mafia of the United States from UNESCO. However, a new professional philosophy was gradually introduced at UNESCO, which until the late 1960s had faithfully followed the dominant Western tradition. Matters of general political concern, colonialism, neocolonialism, racism, peace and war, etc., were admitted as more natural and primary concerns for communication research and policy than had been the case before. The merging of political and professional concerns brought mass media policies and philosophies, including principles of operation and guidelines concerning them for media contents, to professional attention, whereas before they had been typically seen as exclusively political matters to be dealt with in the inner spheres of diplomacy. In this and only this sense, it is correct to say that the new orientation meant a politicization of UNESCO's involvement in the field of communication. In a historical perspective, the new orientation around and within UNESCO reflected not only emerging political and intellectual trends, but also revived projects which had been introduced at the UN Conference on Freedom of Information held in Geneva in 1948, but which were then paralyzed by the Cold War. Before the early 1950s, the UN General Assembly and ECOSOC had considered such questions as freedom of information standards for professional conduct, including an international code of ethics for journalists, and right of reply, highly political terms. However, the international politics of the time did not allow for the elaboration and ECOSOC's submission on freedom of information and the press failed to reach agreement on anything of consequence and disappeared, leaving hardly a trace in history. First, UNESCO was not involved in these unsuccessful attempts, but was instead pursuing its merry way in projects that were largely devoid of conflict. Indeed, the UN and UNESCO had an unspoken division of labor, whereby the former operated at the political and the latter at the technical level. UNESCO's achievements in the technical field, including international agreements on the importation of educational, scientific, and cultural materials, programs for the promotion of books, and support for setting up a national news agencies, particularly in the developing countries. But later, UNESCO was bound to be politicized, as described by Julian Burstock, former director of UNESCO's Division of Free Flow of Information. The beginning of the end of UNESCO's ivory tower was not to become manifest until the mid-1960s. It was the advent of space communication with its capacity for instantaneous worldwide transmission that put UNESCO itself into orbit. A space communication conference held in 1965 produced a report that was published by UNESCO with the prefatory comment that the time had come to move beyond the techniques of communication to a common concern of the content of what is transmitted. More than that, it is evident that in enhancing the power of the mass media to reach and influence vast audience, space communication imposes a common short responsibility for the media to be used for the benefit of all. It was in this situation that the Mass Media Declaration was introduced on UNESCO's agenda in 1972. In fact, the declaration came to serve as a symbol and catalyst for conflict between the forces of the New Order and its adversaries. No wonder then that this document became controversial. It stood not only for what was written in the text, but came to symbolize the struggle between conflicting forces in the world arena as well. In December 1975, when the so-called Nairobi version, including Article 12 on the state responsibility, was prepared in the intergovernment meeting in Paris, the developing and socialist countries seemed to form a broad front, pressing the West into positions of retreat and even despair, as demonstrated by the vote concerning the above-mentioned UN Zionism Racism Resolution, which caused a walkout of the Western Bloc. For details, see Chapter 2. So that's that section, New Professional Perspectives. So basically, we started the academic community of communication scholars in the late 1960s. Not only developing countries, but also in the West, began a gradual change in perspective. Okay, the reorientation proposes beginning with self-critical awareness of how non-political research had in fact promoted conservative mass media policies and ending with a fundamental reappraisal of the scientific world outlook or paradigm which has dominated the tradition of communication research in the West. Since this tradition was mainly made in the United States, made in the USA, the emerging critical school of thought alienated scholars from American authorities who, until the late 1960s, had enjoyed virtual hegemony in the field of study all over the world, with the exception of socialist countries with their Marxist-Leninist approach. So you can see the United States was spreading ideology across the third world. They were using their made in the USA system of conservative mass media policies because they have been using non-political research. With non-political research means white man's, political bias. That's non-political research. Yankee political, racist bias research. White man's racist bias research of the, U.S. government. So that's what non-political research was. And it was promoting conservative mass media policies, ending with a fundamental reappraisal of the scientific world outlook or paradigm, which had dominated the tradition of communication okay, of research in the West. So basically, made in the USA. So so America had complete hegemony, except against the socialist countries. And the more crucial orientation departed from the U.S. mainstream, the more versatile became the field of study where some Marxist scholars had found a legitimate place. Critical orientation started to depart towards the Marxist camp. Okay, the U.S. camp was seen as fraud. They were fraud Western, conservatives. It was a conservative media. They were rapist, butcher, short-tempered Yankee whites. And they need to be expelled from UNESCO for fostering a conservative media and lack of truthful communications. The new orientations in the political as well as the academic sphere were brought together by UNESCO at the meeting of experts on mass communication and society convened in Montreal, Canada in June 1969. The meeting, attended not only by radical advocates of a new academic approach, but also by well-known authorities of the established American tradition, ended up with fairly critical assessments of the state of the art, challenging, among other things, the doctrine of the free flow of information and urging communication scholars to adopt a more committed policy orientation in favor of democratic mass media structures under conditions of cultural identity and national sovereignty. Therein lies the problem for the United States. Okay, basically they were, trying to push democratic mass media structures under conditions of cultural identity and national sovereignty. So obviously, the U.S. mass media does not have democratic ideas. They do not have cultural identity. The U.S. was fostering colonialism, and they were fostering, basically right-wing Yankee, media, and they were fostering cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism and colonialism was what the United States government press, the U.S. mass media was fostering, and the Western press was fostering colonialism and cultural imperialism. Okay, on the basis of the Montreal meeting, the General Conference of UNESCO launched a program for studies in the effects of communication on society, leading in 1971 to the proposals for an international program of communication research. As far as the communication policies were concerned, UNESCO produced the report of the meeting of experts on communication policies and planning, a conceptual document which underlines the importance of research in the formulation of policies and developments of planning strategies to produce communication systems which are functional and fulfill the communication needs of society. So this was the program of communication research and the report of the meeting of the experts of communication policies and planning. Among several projects which followed these UNESCO exercises was a worldwide study of television program structures and flows, as well as a symposium to digest the findings of this inventory, organized at the University of Tampere in Finland. So you can see UNESCO spent a lot of money and time on this communications research. This isn't just, just the third world blacks, just, walking around philosophizing. There was a lot of research involved in this. And the U.S. government should understand that they need to be expelled from UNESCO for not acknowledging the research that went into the mass media declaration and waging war and scandalizing UNESCO after during their withdrawal. So, accordingly, UNESCO served as a central forum for the articulation and mobilization of a new policy-oriented generation of communication research. But it would be misleading to understand the new perspectives as a creation of UNESCO. All that UNESCO did was to facilitate the expression of certain political and intellectual tendencies of the day. So basically, it was misleading to understand the new perspectives as a creation of UNESCO. They were facilitating the expression of certain political and intellectual tendencies of the day. So basically, UNESCO was a central forum for the articulation. Thus, accusations that UNESCO's secretariat was infiltrated by anti-Western elements, who then instigated a radical line in the organization's communication program, are ill-founded. So again, Mabao, he's a black African. They said, he's against the white race, right? That's what the U.S. government said. He's against the white race. They need to be expelled from UNESCO for an obvious racist comment by the U.S. government and their mass media. So, basically, an objective analysis of the geographic and political backgrounds and of the professional performance of the staff in the Secretariat will show that, if anything, it was biased towards an overall Western approach, which in fact has given rise to the concept of an Anglo-Saxon mafia operating within UNESCO. So that's the, what it is. The Anglo-Saxon mafia of the West, the Anglo-Saxon mafia. This would include the United States, Britain, and France, but we would call it the U.S. government mafia, Anglo-Saxon mafia that was operating UNESCO, for which the United States is still in UNESCO and needs to be expelled to get the mafia out of UNESCO. They will destroy this organization because they are an Anglo-Saxon mafia or a U.S. mafia. However, a new professional philosophy was gradually introduced at UNESCO, which until the late 1960s had faithfully followed the dominant Western tradition. Matters of general political concern, colonialism, neocolonialism, racism, peace, and war were admitted as more natural and primary concerns for communication research and policy than had been the case before. Okay, so basically, colonialism, neocolonialism, racism, and peace and war were more natural and primary concerns for communication research and policy. Okay, the professional philosophy was introduced at UNESCO after the late 1960s, when it was faithfully followed the Western tradition. Okay. So they didn't worry about colonialism, neocolonialism, racism, and peace and war. The merging of political and professional concerns brought mass media policies and philosophies, including principles of operation guidelines for media contents, to professional attention. Whereas before they had been typically seen as exclusively political matters to be dealt with in the higher spheres of diplomacy. In this and only this sense, it is correct to say that the new information orientation meant a politicization of UNESCO's involvement in the field of communication. So basically, the mass media policies and philosophies, including principles and guidelines in operation for media contents, professional attention, there were simply political matters to be dealt with in higher spheres of diplomacy, right? That's the way you can just throw it out as some sort of diplomacy. Some bureaucrat will deal with it, and these things aren't to be discussed in basically international organizations that deal with mass communications. That's why the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO, because they are a mafia. They are a mafia against UNESCO principles and charters and covenants. In a historical perspective, the new orientation rounded within UNESCO reflected not only emerging political and intellectual trends, but also revived projects which had been introduced at the UN Conference on Freedom of Information held in Geneva in 1948, but which were then paralyzed by the Cold War. Before the early 1950s, the UN General Assembly and ECOSOC had considered such questions as freedom of information standards for professional conduct, including an international code of ethics for journalists and right of reply, highly political items. So you could see that, basically even before the 1950s, freedom of information standards for professional conduct, including an international code of ethics for journalists and right of reply, were important. However, the international policies of the time did not allow for their elaboration. ECOSOC, Subcommission on the Freedom of Information and of the Press, failed to reach agreement on anything of consequence and disappeared, leaving hardly a trace in history. So that's largely because of the United States, right? The United States would not allow these ideas of freedom of information, professional conduct, and ethics for journalists. They did not want these kinds of ideas. So they, booted UNESCO. They booted out of UNESCO. They walked out of UNESCO. First, UNESCO was not involved in these unsuccessful attempts, but was instead pursuing a merry way in projects that were largely devoid of conflict. Indeed, the UN and UNESCO had an unspoken division of labor, whereby the former operated at the political and the latter at the technical level. UNESCO's achievements in the technical field included international agreements on the importation of education, scientific, and cultural materials, programs for the promotion of books, and support for the setting up of news agencies, national news agencies, particularly in developing countries. Okay, so this is what UNESCO does. Their education, their science, and their journalism. And the United States attacks education. They bomb universities. If you look at El Salvador, Panama, Guatemala, they bomb universities. They burn books. They censor books. They censor the press. They murder journalists. They murder university professors. They murder scientists. They assassinate scientists. They attack journalists. They imprison journalists. They imprison university professors. And they imprison scientists. The United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO for their attack on education, culture, science, and the media and journalism. But later UNESCO was bound to be politicized, as described by Julian Burstock, former director of UNESCO's Division of Free Flow of Information. A space communication conference held in 1965 produced a report that was published by UNESCO with the prefatory comment that the time had come to move beyond the techniques of communication to a common concern with the content of what is transmitted. More than that, it is evident that an enhancing power of the mass media to reach and influence vast audience space and communication imposes a commensurate responsibility for the media to be used for the benefit of all. So they were trying to promote a socially acceptable statement. Julian Burstock, director of UNESCO's Division of Free Flow of Information, UNESCO was pushing for a socially acceptable information block because the United States had a space communication system that was liable to be abused to spread ideology through the third world, which is what they did. The United States spread ideology for which they need to be expelled from UNESCO. It was in this situation that the Mass Media Declaration was introduced on UNESCO's agenda in 1972. The declaration came to serve as a symbol and catalyst for conflict between the forces of the New Order and its adversaries. In December 1975, when the so-called Nairobi version, including Article 12 on state responsibility, was prepared in the intergovernmental meeting in Paris, the developing and social countries seemed to form a broad front, pressing the West into positions of retreat and even despair, as demonstrated by the vote concerning the above-mentioned UN Zionism racism resolution, which caused a walkout of the Western Bloc. So these kinds of things, like walking out of meetings, like short-tempered, immature Yankee wives, requires an expulsion from UNESCO. The Western Bloc walked out. The British, the French, and the United States press, and whatever Western Bloc countries were part of it, walked out of this meeting when they were condemning Zionism, racism, right? They wanted apartheid. They wanted murder of Palestinians. That's the U.S. government. That's the butcher, rapist, short-tempered Yankee whites. So Western counterattack. We're going to finish up with Western counterattack. At this time, a counterattack was mobilized in the West with the aid of old and new mass media lobbies and the publicly provided by the international news agencies and commercial media themselves. The draft declaration served as an early warning device, as the UN and UNESCO resolutions on direct broadcasting satellites had done a few years before. However, the most alarming developments for Western eyes were the events of the non-aligned movement reviewed above. No doubt such developments gave rise to Western concerns and counterattacks, which in the absence of a direct diplomatic participation took the form of a journalistic campaign over the Western mass media. Targets of attack were the news agency pool and other manifestations of the information struggle in the non-aligned movement. But this mobilization, the reaction, did not neglect UNESCO. An attack was launched against the first regional conference of communication policies organized in San Jose, Costa Rica in July 1976. The San Jose Conference opened in a terse, tense setting. The IAPA's officer, headed by George Beebe and German Orens, established an opposition command post across the street from the UNESCO conference. They held meeting with the press and effectively established an opposition presence. Mr. Mabau invited the IAPA leadership to discuss the news media issues. There seemed to be some convergence of views, but that did not persist once the session began. The IAPA adamantly foresaw the undermining of freedom of expression if communication policies were approved. The press of the Americas, said the IAPA, is before one of the most unusual threats it has ever faced in all of its turbulent history. So, in November 1976, attention was concentrated on the Nairobi, Kenya, where the General Conference of the UNESCO met in the 19th session, and where, according to Western media coverage, the life or death of press freedom was to be determined by the draft declaration. The seriousness of this counter-offensive in the mass media field is indicated by the fact that it was not only a campaign waged through daily and weekly press coverage, but strongly supported by committed lobby organizations, the International Press Institute, the American Press Association. Furthermore, more or less academic studies and books also began to appear in support of this counteroffensive. However, these conservative voices by no means dominated the community of communication research. The bulk of scholars either remained uncommitted and quite ignorant of the issues involved, or went along with the academic reorientation towards new perspectives discussed above. The counteroffensive from the West, like the previous strategic stage when the Western powers were generally on the defensive, was by no means a matter of communication politics only, but fundamentally a question of overall international politics. At this stage, the dominant Western line had also become harder in a number of other issues where its interests were at stake. Free from world economy, UNCTAD, and so-called North-South dialogue, to ideology, East-West relations. In particular, the Soviet-American relations deteriorated from the relaxed state of detente, which had dominated the first half of the 1970s, with such historical achievements as Strategic Arm Limitations Treaty, signed in 1972 in Moscow by President Nixon and Secretary General Brezhnev. And the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, signed in 1975 in Helsinki by 35 heads of state, including President Ford and Brezhnev. It may be significant that this respect that towards the end of 1970s, the U.S. administration adopted a strategy of trilateralism, whereby the Western world, USA, Western Europe, and Japan, was being mobilized to a stronger and more coherent defending its interests. So there's that section, Western counterattack, an important section. Let's just go through it. So basically, most alarming developments for Western eyes were the events in the non-aligned movement that we talked about. We talked about the non-aligned movement. No doubt such developments gave rise to Western concerns and counterattacks, which in the absence of direct diplomatic participation, took the form of a journalistic campaign over the Western mass media. So you can see the U.S. government, the U.S. media, organized a journalistic campaign in the Western press to target the news agency pools and the information struggle in the non-aligned movement. But this mobilization of reactions did not neglect UNESCO. An attack against UNESCO was launched against the first regional conference on communication policies organized in San Jose, Costa Rica in July 1976. The San Jose Conference opened in a tense setting. The International Association of Press Association officers, headed by George Beebe and German Orns, established an opposition command post across the street from UNESCO conference. So basically, they terrorized the UNESCO meeting by an IAPA press sitting across the street. How dare the Yankees terrorize UNESCO? These are scoundrels, scandalizing UNESCO with this sort of behavior by creating a press agency across the street to criticize the UNESCO meeting. They need to be expelled from UNESCO. That they held meeting with the press and effectively establish an opposition presence. Mr. Mabau invited the IAP leadership to discuss the news media issues. There seemed to be some convergence of views, but that did not persist once the session began. The IAPA adamantly foresaw the undermining of freedom of expression of communication policies were approved. The press of the Americas said the IAPA is before one of the most unusual threats it has ever faced in its turbulent history. So again, the U.S. mass media, the IAPA, the International Association of Press Attendees, or IAPA, the International Association of Press Officers, IAPA, established a meeting across the street from the UNESCO meeting to belittle and taunt the UNESCO meeting that was establishing a mass media declaration. Again, this is a violation of proper international collaboration. You cannot, harass a, international world body like UNESCO and get away with it. But the United States does it all the time. They harass all international bodies. They walk over all international covenants, the OAS, the United Nations, UNESCO, you name it, the United States walks over it because they feel they're, simpleton whites that are allowed to object to anything stated. They need to be expelled from UNESCO to show them that they mean nothing to the third world. They are useless. They're a country of colonialists. They're a country of education attackers. They destroy education. They destroy science. They destroy journalism. They are a group of propagandist ministry of defamatory Yankees. So basically, that was it. So in October to November 1976, attention was concentrated on Nairobi, Kenya, where the General Conference in UNESCO met at its 19th session and where, according to Western media coverage, the life or death of press freedom was to be determined by the draft declaration. So Nairobi, Kenya was where the draft declaration was originally conceived. The seriousness of this counteroffensive in the mass media field is indicated by the fact that this was not the only campaign waged through daily and weekly press coverage, but strongly supported by the committed lobby organizations such as International Press Institute and the Inter-American Press Association. I'm sorry, the IAPA is the International American Press Association. So the committed lobby organization for weekly press coverage waged a campaign. The counteroffensive was a campaign waged daily and weekly press coverage, but strongly opposed, supported by committee lobby of the IPI, the International Press Institute, and the Inter-American Press Association, large Western press outlets. Furthermore, more or less academic studies and books also began to appear in support of this counteroffensive. So totally a propaganda ministry. They paid academic scholars to produce fraudulent research to say that UNESCO was, the UNESCO mass media declaration should not be adhered to. However, these conservative voices by no means dominated the community of communications research. The bulk of scholars in the fields either remained uncommitted and quite ignorant of the issues involved, or went along with the academic reorientation towards new perspectives discussed above. So they tried to, assault the UNESCO mass media declaration with an assault from the Western scholars and Western press. The counteroffensive from the West, like the previous strategic stage, when the Western powers were generally on the defensive, was by no means a matter of communication politics only, but fundamentally a question of overall international politics. At this stage, the dominant Western line also became harder in a number of other issues where its interests were at stake, from world economy, UNCTAD, and so-called North-South dialogue, to ideology East-West relations. In particular, Soviet-American relations deteriorated from the relaxed state of the detente, which dominated the first half of the 1970s. With such historical achievements as the Strange Arms Limitation Treaty, signed in 1972 in Moscow by President Nixon and Secretary General Brezhnev, and the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, signed in 1975 by 35 heads of state, including President Ford and Brezhnev. It may also be significant in this respect that towards the end of the 1970s, the U.S. administration adopted a strategy of trilateralism, whereby the Western world, USA, Western Europe, and Japan, was being mobilized to be a stronger and more coherent in defending its interests. So basically, the West was the counteroffensive. Basically, the Western powers were generally on the defensive. Was no means a matter of communication politics only, but fundamentally a question of overall international politics. At this stage, the dominant Western line became harder in a number of issues where its interests were at stake, from world economy, East-West relations, and ideology. So they fought hard for ideology, American imperialism ideology, and colonial ideology. That's what they looked for. Soviet-American relations deteriorated from a lax state of detente, which had dominated the first half of the 1970s. So then they had the agreement signed. So that's basically it. So the West went on a counterattack, and they tried to wage a campaign. And IAPA set up a press station across the street from the UNESCO conference in 1976, the Costa Rica conference, in which they tried to harass the blacks, Asians, and Hispanics that were trying to put together the mass media declaration. That's the West, always trying to harass people, always trying to stop, the mass media declaration and stop ethics in journalism and responsibilities in journalism. Again, please buy the book, Mass Media Declaration of UNESCO. Please buy it from Amazon. It is available, and it is an excellent book, and I recommend you read this book, get it on print and PDF. So again, we're going to finish. We're going to finish with, again, the reason I do these presentations in all of my books is that I want the United States expelled from UNESCO. The United States actions against all of the member states, their, they're scandalizing UNESCO from 1980 to 1984. They're, scandalizing the organization with hate rhetoric and hate, hysterical hate, Yankee ideas from 1980 and 1984 requires the United States to be expelled from UNESCO. I mean, they withdrew withdrew. Okay, they withdrew. Ronald Reagan withdrew. So, you withdraw. You got to back your withdrawer up. You waged a war. You scandalized. You are scoundrels. You are a mafia group of whites. Okay, you scandalized this organization for 4 years, and then even after that, for multiple years after that. And then 37 years goes by. You don't do anything. You don't participate in third world politics. You don't worry about the third world. You stay out of the organization. You do your own politicization, colonial wars. Bush invades Panama. Reagan wages war on Nicaragua. Bush invades Iraq. After that, you have, multiple wars. Afghanistan war. All of this stuff. You invade Iraq, Afghanistan, and then Iran. Okay, now you have a government that didn't go into the UNESCO. They're not in UNESCO. And then suddenly in 2023, you're no longer colonialists. You haven't proven that. For 37 years, you've been waging war against the third world. You've been attacking education, science, culture, and journalism in the third world. And for that, you have no business rejoining. You do not have the privilege to be part of UNESCO. And you need to be expelled from UNESCO. The United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO for waging war, attacking education, attacking, science, culture, and journalism in the third world, and for attacking member states, for kidnapping Maduro, and instituting an drug terrorism propaganda system against UNESCO truth. It's a fraudulent missile of lies. It's a propaganda system of defamatory propaganda by the U.S. government against Maduro. For that, they need to be expelled from UNESCO. You waged war against Iran. You murdered school children. You attacked education. You attacked journalism in Iran. We see the infrastructure destruction. We see the attack on journalists, the attack on media, the attack on school children. You need to be expelled from UNESCO for your action in Iran. And you are blockading Cuba illegally, trying to prevent the Cubans from having normal journalism, from having normal education, for normal science, for normal culture. That's why you need to be expelled from UNESCO. The United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. And our statement is the United States needs to be expelled from UNESCO. That's why we're given this big picture presentations on YouTube and, for, just general review of the book. So please buy the book. I'll be back tomorrow with another, 15, probably 20 pages. Glad you could join us today. Chris and I are with the I Think Tank and Delray Beats. Have a great day.